My name is Nick. I am by trade a television editor slash producer slash what have you. I've worked in TV now for almost 20 years. You'd probably know my work mostly from the Netflix show, The Toys That Made Us. So outside of my day job as a television editor, I have a side project I do. It's an online show called The Secret Compartment. It's essentially an online vintage toy discussion show. There's no shortage of that these days. If you go on YouTube, there's countless channels devoted to the topic of toy collecting, be it modern or vintage or both, everything in between. And I, being a toy collector and being somebody who is well-versed in media creation, this was for me a way to kind of combine my two biggest loves into one passion project. And the goal was to kind of take the contemporary trope of the YouTube toy collector show and both kind of turn the idea on its head and also kind of reinvent it into something a little more unique and elevated. It's a show I make with my friend and my partner, Rich Myrick, who I met while working on The Toys That Made Us. We host the show along with the classic 1979 action figure Rom Space Knight, who, as it turns out, is a angry, bitter, washed up, cantankerous son of a bitch. When it comes to collecting, I'm a child of the late 70s and 80s, early 90s. A lot of it is pretty obvious, I think. You know, it's a lot of the obvious stuff you would see for somebody who grew up in that era and was brainwashed by all of those properties. I collect Star Wars, I collect Masters of the Universe, G.I. Joe, Transformers, Ninja Turtles. The thing that's so wonderful about that time is it was so dense with toy lines and properties. There is so much you can collect, and I have made it my mission to try and collect as many of those as possible. While I do have a nice selection of the more obvious mainstream stuff, I have my weird little niche lines. I have things like Rocks and Bugs and Things, Matchbox's Parasites. Who the hell knows what Parasites is? Blurt Balls. That sounds like a medical condition, but it's actually a toy line from the early 90s. They're basically like Mad Balls, but a little bit better. And they were actually designed by the same people. I know some collectors like to have a focus, and I have a focus, but my focus just happens to be everything. And in doing that, I have to be a little curated. I have to keep my collection a little curated because it's easy to go off the rails and just glut the shelves up with shit. For example, I'm a big Masters of the Universe fan, but if you see my vintage Masters of the Universe collection, it's the core characters from the first 2 years of the line. And everybody says, why don't you have a complete collection? You're a big Masters of the Universe fan. And I said, well, I could, but then I wouldn't have anywhere to put all these other lines. Where would I put all these Black Star guys, and these Warrior Beasts, and these Warlord figures, and these Crystar figures? And so sometimes you got to make hard choices, and you need to be a little bit more selective and a little more curated when your focus is everything. I collect because I grew up in a household where collecting was the norm. If you were to take this room and transmogrify everything into like mom trinkets, that's what my parents' house would look like. I grew up getting dragged to antique stores and flea markets. Add to that the fact that I grew up in an era of flagrant, unchecked marketing that permanently warped the minds of an entire generation to the point where we have arguably unhealthily melded our identities with these properties because they were foisted on us when we were at such a delicate developmental stage in our lives. And now here I am. It's how many years? 35, 40 years later, and here I am with the same shit that I've had since I was 5. Is this fun? Yes. Is it also kind of a mental illness? Absolutely. Guilty. So part of my mental illness, as it relates to my collecting, dictates that the style in which I collect all comes down to the presentation. And I try to model my collection as close to, for lack of a better term, a museum exhibit as I possibly can. Because I think of this stuff first and foremost as art. I think of this stuff as pop art, really. Yes, these are toys that were commercially mass-produced for children to play with. But there is a aesthetic to them, there is an artifice to them, there is a style to them. Everything on these shelves is the product of deliberate, creative process executed by artists and designers who, yes, they were collecting a paycheck at a corporate-owned toy company, but they were exercising their artistic muscles. They were creating art. And so for me, it's important to present these items on my shelves as close to the original creative intention as possible. And so because of that, I treat them like specimens in a museum display. And so I want them to be as clean and pure and fresh as possible, so that when you see them, you go, oh, that's Tex Hex. And that is exactly how Tex Hex was designed and intended to look by the artists who made him. This makes my life a little difficult because a lot of times I have to hold out and wait until I can get certain items in the condition that I feel is worthy of going on these shelves, as opposed to just like compromising and saying, well, I want that, it's a little beat up, but I need that one. And so I have collections that have taken longer than others to build out because it's not good enough. I think of it like it's almost like a visual reference. You can look at these shelves and see like, that's the line, those are the toys, they're complete, that's what all their accessories are. There's kind of like a historical, archaeological aspect to it. Again, this is me. I know not all collectors are like this. I know some collectors, they don't mind to see a little scuff and rough on their figures because it tells a story. And to be honest, for some of the items in my collection, especially some of the ones that I've had since childhood, that is the case. For example, my Kenner Star Wars collection, 90% of that collection is my collection from when I was a child. As a kid, I took very good care of my toys, but I did play with them. So if you look at them, you are gonna see some scuffs. You are gonna see some missing accessories. For me, for that line in particular, because it has so much autobiographical significance for me, I don't feel hard-pressed to upgrade that collection. I don't feel hard-pressed to go in and replace some of those with nicer, cleaner ones. Because in that particular example, the history wrapped up in them does kind of top the glitz and glamour I would have with like a freshly upgraded Star Wars collection. Not to mention that Kenner Star Wars figures are some of the most expensive things you can try and, especially if you want really nice minty ones. And rather than spend all that money to upgrade my Star Wars collection, that's money I could spend on other things. There's always that one line that a lot of collectors have that they focus on more than any, or just holds a special place for them. For me, personally, my favorite property from that era is Masters of the Universe. A lot of that goes all the way back to my early childhood. My life kind of revolved around that and Star Wars. And Star Wars has since become so all-encompassing and prevalent and almost to the point of being oppressive in how ubiquitous it is, that I feel like over the years Star Wars has lost a little bit of the magic for me because it's just been endlessly crammed down our throats. And for a very long time, Masters of the Universe was this kind of forgotten byproduct of that era, even though it was one of the biggest things to happen in the 1980s in terms of toy lines and children's entertainment. And that kind of added to its mystique, that when the 80s properties were starting to become in vogue a little bit, like back in the, I would say, mid-aughts. We started to get the Michael Bay Transformer movies, and they tried to do G.I. Joe movies, but But Masters of the Universe was kind of the redheaded stepchild of the big properties of that era. That added to the mystique. I kind of reassessed it and revisited it at a point and fell back in love with it all over again. It's interesting how you can kind of have an appreciation for something as a kid and then have a completely different appreciation for it as an adult. And that was kind of what happened for me with that property. As an adult, and as an adult who is a creative, I just really dialed in on how vibrant and colorful and weird that property is. How it seemingly has no rules. It's barbaric high fantasy married with space and science fiction, and I just really loved the whole kind of lawlessness of it all. How anything went. If it was weird and wild and you could make a cool toy of it or a cool character out of it, it worked in the line. And so to this day, it's still my main squeeze in terms of these old properties. And so now the thing is, I have less vintage toys for Masters of the Universe, but I have more random merchandise and ephemera from the era, because at my age now, that stuff seems more fascinating than the toys. It was a grossly over-merchandised property. Anything you can think of that could have a He-Man or a Skeletor plastered on it was made. And I have a nice little collection of random Masters of the Universe merchandise. The stuff I have is the tip of the iceberg. It's insane how much stuff there was. So that's definitely been a quest of quality over quantity, because again, I like a lot of stuff, and so I have to be very careful with how I curate and pare things down and only focus on quality over quantity. When it comes to Grail items, there are things you have that you are proud of because they are valuable. And then there are things you have that you are proud of because you just really love them. And for me personally, I don't like to get caught up in the trophy-ness of it all. Some of my favorite items in my collection are some of the cheapest, most common items. I have items that are more expensive, and maybe I felt the need to spend a lot of money on them at the time because I really wanted it, but then in hindsight I realized, yes, I like this, but this dumb thing I bought for 20 bucks, if the house was on fire, I'd probably take that first. And then there are items that are both, like I just really wanted them, but then it just so happened to be expensive. So for me personally, it changes a lot in terms of what I feel a special affinity for at any given time. It depends on what point in my life I'm at, or it depends on what phase I'm in. As collectors, we all have those phases where we kind of latch on to a toy line or a property that we get really super fixated on and obsessed with for a period of time. And then we kind of like get, oh, squirrel, we get interested in something else. Here's a good example of one that has a really strong personal significance for me. And that is my LJN V doll. The V miniseries from the 1980s. It's one of my favorite pieces of television ever made. And it dropped at a really formative time in my life. I was very young, and it just really made a big impact on me. And while a lot of the themes were over my head for the time, I could tell even as a kid there was just more meat on the bones with that show. And I had the LJN V doll, and it was a doll that I lost as a kid. If you lost a toy, and it was a toy that was no longer on store shelves, you just lost that toy. And you had to hope you found one somewhere down the line. And so for many years of my childhood, the V doll was the one that got away, because it literally got away. I lost that doll. It was heartbreaking. Flash forward many years later, now into the late 90s, as a surprise Christmas gift from my mom, I was given a new mint inbox LJN V doll. And it was one of those presents where it wasn't a gift I asked for. I had no idea this was coming. And it was one of the most pleasantly surprising gifts I've ever received. And to this day, I still have it, and I refuse to take it out of the box because of the circumstances surrounding how I got that. Another one would be the Superpowers Batmobile. That was a toy I had wanted for my entire childhood and never got. And much like the V-Doll, the Batmobile was a surprise Christmas gift from now, flash forward so many years after that, from my girlfriend. And it was the same thing. I didn't ask for that. I didn't tell her I wanted that. In classic girlfriend style, she heard me talking about how I'd always wanted one, how cool I thought it was. That Batmobile is one of the coolest toys of the 1980s. And so finally getting one, and in such another pleasantly surprising way, was really cool. I'm particularly stoked on this thing. This is a Spanish, as in from Spain, in-store display for these little hokey toy watches that have He-Man and Skeletor faces. But they're not actually operating watches. They just have little dials you could turn. It has like 4 times, times of day that you can rotate through the eyeballs. This thing, I just randomly came across this once on eBay. And I had never seen it before. I didn't know it existed. It has ridiculous artwork. It's got Zodak on it, which is cool because Zodak never gets a lot of love. It's just a really weird, unique thing. This is what I was talking about, in that they just made everything and put a Masters of the Universe logo on it. Everybody who comes in here sees this thing and is immediately what the hell is that? My Rocks and Bugs and Things, that was a toy line from 85 or 86 from Ideal Toys. It is one of those very strange one-off toy lines that nobody knew about. I always felt like if I ever met collectors who were into that line, it's like this secret club. And so as an adult, I've had to track them down over the years. They're very hard to find in nice condition. They're very hard to find with the little mortal creatures that they're designed to eat. That is one of my favorite toy lines ever. But if I'm being perfectly honest, my absolute favorite, most cherished item in this whole room is Max. You look at a collection like this and you say, Nick, you couldn't possibly need anything more. And you would be absolutely right. I don't need anything more. In fact, I should probably stop. But I want more. And so, are there things I'm looking for? Yes. Am I going to tell you what they are? No. It has generally been a rule of thumb, for me personally, to not discuss items I am on the hunt for, because by doing that, this is a pro tip, by the way, so I'm cluing you into some privileged information. If you go around town blabbing about what you're looking for, you're gonna tip off other people who maybe didn't know that thing existed or that it's something that's worth tracking down, and now you've got that many more people you're competing with to track that item down. And so, shy of a few sellers and dealers who could maybe find me that thing, or close friends, I don't talk about that. I am very active online, probably more active than I should be. I waste a lot of time on Instagram. I have my personal account, Fuzz Fang, where I sometimes post my art, but I mostly post pictures of my toys because I don't have a lot of time to make art these days. And when I do make art, I make the Secret Compartment. And I'm on Instagram for Secret Compartment 2, the_secret_compartment_show. Why did I make a handle that long and unwieldy? I don't know, but there it is. There's also thesecretcompartment.com. That's probably a lot easier to remember. From there, you can get to our Instagram account. You can get to our YouTube channel. Our shows are posted on the website and they're posted on YouTube. I also have my personal portfolio website, fuzzfang.com. You could look at my art. You can see my editing reel. You can see what shows I work on. I can be contacted professionally through there. It's not difficult to find me online. I am proud of my collection, but not necessarily because I just bought a bunch of shit and shoved it in cabinets. I'm proud of my collection because of the way I have channeled my creativity into my collection is what I'm more proud of. Because for me, personally, just the act of amassing things isn't something you should necessarily be proud of because you're just kind of consuming. But more so, what do you do with that stuff once you have it? And for me, I use my collection as a way to kind of exercise my creativity and how I display and how I stage the room, how I light the room. You know, I grew up in Southern California going to Disneyland, and I think from a very young age, going to Disneyland had a big, subconsciously maybe, had a big impact on me in terms of lighting and atmosphere and setting a mood. And for me, that's always been a priority with how I display my collection. If I can't light it a certain way and stage it a certain way and arrange it a certain way and create a vibe with it, it's almost kind of pointless. Then it's just a pile of stuff. And so the pride I take in my collection is not because of how much of it I've wasted my money on, but in how I have chosen to display it and create an environment with it. When people come into my home and they come into this room, everybody's face lights up when they come in here. And that's regardless of whether or not they're toy collectors. You can make two different impressions on someone with the same toy collection based on how you've chosen to present it. And because how you present it and how you display it and kind of the way you position it to be interpreted by someone is the difference between an oh and a oh.